When President Lincoln issued this final Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, he explicitly stated in the proclamation that it was, quote, a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion. So this is clearly a war measure, and we have a copy so that any visitor can really take a look at what Lincoln actually says in this proclamation. He identifies the states in rebellion, and in paragraph 6, he orders the recruitment of our soldiers. This proclamation is in fact an agreement that Lincoln makes with our soldiers, that if they'll come into the Federal Army, help save the Union, then they can legally free themselves by bringing states in rebellion back into the Union. So we present this proclamation really for the visitor to read, because often we don't really look at it. We just hear that Lincoln freed the slaves, when it's important to note that what President Lincoln does with this proclamation is he declares free slaves, and he makes it legal for them to join the Union Army and free themselves. And that's the story that we tell. And many of the heroes that we honor were enslaved men. The vast majority of our soldiers were enslaved men. However, this gentleman right here, he's one of the 25 men of African descent that earned the Congressional Medal of Honor. His name is Christian Fleetwood. He is out of Baltimore, Maryland, and he was the Sergeant Major of the 4th United States Colored Troops, which was organized in Baltimore. The significance of him being here also in this museum on U Street is after the war, he did move to U Street. So he was a local citizen. And when we talk about this community began as a contraband camp, a camp for runaways during the Civil War. And after the war, the soldiers are very important members of this community in building it up and making it a vibrant community that becomes one of the most affluent African-American communities in the country. And this gentleman right here, his name is Robert Smalls. Now, he was enslaved when the war began. He gets national attention for commandeering, along with 8 other African-American crewmen on a Confederate ship, the Planter, for commandeering that ship and turning it over to the Union. He subsequently becomes the captain of the ship, which served as a Union Army supply ship. After the war, Captain Smalls is elected to the House of Representatives. That's the U.S. House of Representatives. He serves in the House of Representatives for 8 terms, so about 16 years he serves in the House of Representatives. So these heroes, like Smalls, like Fleetwood, their contribution is not only during the war, but after the war as well. Now, we have the Douglass boys. We have the Douglass boys, both Lewis and Charles, here in the museum. Frederick Douglass had 3 sons. 2 of his sons, Lewis and Charles, both served in the 54th Massachusetts, but his middle son, Frederick Jr., he worked mostly as a recruiter and a spy master out in the Mississippi Valley and did not enlist in the Army. Now, again, I said we have photographs of 2 of the men of African descent that earned the Congressional Medal of Honor during the Civil War, and this gentleman, Sergeant William Carney, received his medal on May 22nd, 1900. It is often stated that he was the first African American to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. That statement reflects often the poor scholarship on African Americans during the Civil War, even though there are renowned African American scholars who will make that misstatement. Sergeant Carney was the 51st African American to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. However, his action on July 18, 1863 was the first action that resulted in a Medal of Honor. But the first African American to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor was a sailor by the name of Robert Blake. And Robert Blake received his medal on December 28th, 1864. I need to correct that. That was his action was on December 28th, 1863. He received his medal on April 28th, 1863. So that was the first African American to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor, Robert Blake. Now, again, newspaper prints, photographs and newspaper prints. Among some of our newspaper prints are the officers out of the Louisiana Native Guard. The first African-American officers to serve in the American military were these officers. They were commissioned in 1862, September of 1862, and there's a newspaper article on them in Harper's Weekly, February 28, 1863, where the reporter actually travels with that regiment and speaks of these officers, and in the newspaper was the print of the officers. Now again, this reflects some of our challenges. There are renowned scholars who will say that African Americans were denied commissions. Well, most were. It was very difficult for an African American to receive a commission, but to make it a blanket statement that there were no African American officers, which you will sometimes hear, is completely inaccurate. And in fact, we can go to the primary sources, the newspaper accounts, and then the official records, and find these African-American officers. Again, back to our mission, steering you back toward the primary sources. This is one of the first major battles in which African-Americans were involved. May 27, 1862, in New Orleans. In fact, African-American officer, Captain Andre Kyu, led the assault on Port Hudson in Louisiana. This is an often seen photograph, but we have here the print. In the first room, we actually have the photograph of Gordon, Peter Gordon. Often when you see him in textbooks, he will be without a name. But on July 4th, 1863, this print appeared in Harper's Weekly along with an article about Mr. Gordon, who enlisted in the Union Army, served in the 58th United States Colored Troops out of Mississippi. Now, again, the most important print I always like to mention, in fact, I try not to allow a visitor to leave without pointing out this print, which is the Federal Army entering Richmond on April 3rd, 1865, and when one looks at that print, one sees clearly that the men who captured the capital of the Confederacy were men of African descent. One of the best kept secrets in American history, that American soldiers of African descent captured the capital of the Confederacy. In fact, if we go to President Lincoln, he makes it very clear that without the help of the black freedmen, the war against the South could not have been won. So what we try to do is bring the names of those men to life. And this is an example. This plaque here on display is an example of the plaques that we have on the Wall of Honor. And we have 209,145 names on that Wall of Honor. Only from the United States Colored Troops, though. So the sailors that served, their names aren't on our Wall of Honor. Though our statue has a sailor on it, the Navy was integrated, and it's rather difficult to identify the men of African descent who served in the Federal Navy. We do know, however, from Department of Navy reports that approximately 25% of the Federal Navy was comprised of men of African descent. And when we look at the names on our wall, they represent about 10% of the U.S. Army. So that's 10% of the U.S. Army, 25% of the U.S. Navy, comprised of men of African descent. But still, there's more to be added. We have here a book put together by Juanita Patience Moss. And in this book, it's actually blacks in white regiments. And there are African Americans who served in integrated regiments. Thousands who served in integrated regiments. So it's going to be more than 10% once we identify them, if we're ever able to, because again, they're in integrated regiments. Now, some of the artifacts we have in the museum are these items that are found on battlefields, like at Manassas. Most of these items in this case were found at Manassas. Again, to restate our mission here at this museum, it is to tell a long forgotten and suppressed story of how Americans of African descent rise from under the weight of their oppression, answer a cry for help from the federal government, they help save the Union, and they free themselves. And we do that by steering you back toward the primary sources, where the truth can be.